We used to live in Blandon near a certain apartment near the railroad tracks. And when I say near the railroad tracks, I mean the railroad tracks were here, right? They were right beside a house down from the apartment we lived in at an intersection, which means this, that about every 45 minutes, day and night, we would blaringly hear this train blow its whistle. Nothing else could be heard or thought about when this train was blowing its whistle day and night, every 45 minutes, right? Loud. But you know what happened? Over the course of a few months, guess what happened? We didn't hear it anymore. Does that make sense? We just had gotten used to this. Day and night, slept fine. Even during the day, it did not startle us one bit. We could talk and hear, and this train, we were numb to it. We got used to it, right? We would have friends over, and the train would go off, and they'd be startled. They'd look around, and we didn't even know what they were startled about. There's a sense in which this parable, maybe typically known as the prodigal son, I'm going to call it the tale of two lost sons this morning. There's a sense in which this parable is like that. It's like the train. You've heard it before. Maybe the first time you heard it, it was startling to you. But now that you've heard it several times, right? Maybe you've gotten used to it, and maybe the danger is that you just don't hear it anymore. Does that make sense? I want to invite us to tune our hearts and our ears to hear this parable afresh. Maybe even let it startle you. But this is Jesus' parable he tells. There's a sense in which it's about a family, right? There's a father with two sons. And really there's what I've noticed about my own upbringing and my own growing up with siblings, and even as I'm now a dad, I notice there's two types of sinners. And even in a room this size, I guarantee there's also two types of sinners even here. One type of sinner is this. It's the overt rebel, but there's another kind that's the covert rebel. And here's what I mean. And when I had a brother growing up. I have a second brother too, but he came along much later. So really, most of my little kid days were myself and my brother, much like this story. And here's what the overt rebel does. The parents will say, "Don't cross this line," and the overt rebel will do this. Just step right across the line. But the covert rebel is different. The parents say, "Don't cross this same line." And while the parents aren't looking, the covert rebel sees that no one can see him, and he'll cross the line, and he can hear the footsteps of the parents coming back in the room, and he has enough time to get back across the line again. So when the parents see him, he looks like he's well behaved. Both are rebels. One is just obvious, and the other one is sneaky. Does that make sense? I was the second one. My brother was the overt rebel. And I learned over the years how to be the covert rebel, looking good to those who would notice. But the rebellion is just as much there. And the danger is I could label myself as obedient when really the heart of the matter is that I wasn't. That's what this parable is about. We know it's about that because Jesus, in verses 1, 2, and 3 of chapter 15, the author Luke records for us what prompts this famous parable. And maybe you've not noticed the prompting of this famous parable before, but if you look with me, I'm going to read Luke 15, just 1, 2, and 3 right now, and notice the situation that prompts Jesus to tell this story that you've heard so many times. Here's what he says. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him, being Jesus. And the Pharisees and scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." You see verse 3 there? So he told them this parable. This is what prompts Jesus telling the famous story of the prodigal son, is that there's two kinds of sinners. One's obvious, sinners and tax collectors. The other group are covert rebels that need to hear a story about these two types. Now let me read for you verses 11 to 24 as we'll look at the story in three ways. First, the rebellious younger son. Secondly, the religious older son. And third, we'll notice the father. Point number one, the rebellious younger son. Let me read for you verses 11 to 24. If you'd follow along with me. And he said, there was a man who had two sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. And not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the field to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But he came to himself and said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, the father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found. And they began to celebrate. If you notice with me the actions of the son here that Jesus emphasizes for us in this telling. Notice all the verbs, if you would. You see it there in verse 12? He says to his father, I want to take the share of the property that's coming to me. Here's what he's saying. He wants to take the share of his inheritance that the father has faithfully and generously and lovingly been saving up for his son all these years. And he says, Father, I'd like it now. Now, you know the thing about inheritance. Inheritance normally comes to the sons when the father has passed. That's not the time. He still has his father. So what he's saying is this. You know what you're going to give me, Dad, when you're gone? I like that now. Meaning, Dad, I wish you were dead. Really, Father, when it comes to you or your stuff, I'd rather have your stuff than you. This is what he says to his father. And then verse 13, do you notice there? He gathered all that he had. Notice in verse 13, he took a journey into a far country. Not just as he had the attitude against his father that he wishes he was gone, but the son now puts more distance and rejection between himself and his father. Imagine, fathers in the room, if your son were to say this and do this to you. The son that you love, the son that you're generous to, the son that you're saving up for, the son you're providing for, that you're affectionate towards, says, I wish you were gone. Actually, give me all that's mine. I'd rather have your stuff than you, and I'm going to take off, never to see you again. Friends, the father is devastated. Notice how the story takes a turn in verse 13 and 14. There in this far country, he squandered his property in reckless living. After a while, and it didn't take long, he had gone through all the money. He has no job. He spent all his father's wealth that he gave him. He's buying drinks at the party. He says to all, the party's on me. This is the son that buys the BMW, crashes it, buys another one, crashes that one too, right? He is squandering all of the wealth that his father had given him. And in verse 14, he says he spent it all. Imagine the father's wealth, the father's love, the father's generosity, put it in dollars, and the son just runs through it. Almost like the love that the father had saved up, the son would rather not have it. Jesus tells this vivid story to give us, friends, a deeper definition of sin. Sin is not merely misbehavior. Rather, sin is an attitude against the Father. The sinfulness of sin, you see, it isn't in the reckless living, but the sinfulness of sin is in an attitude against God. Verses 14 to 16, we see the rock bottom that the son experiences. It says he began to be in need. Do you see it there? Other details provided for us here as the son hits rock bottom. It also mentions he's longing for the food that the pigs are eating. Imagine being that hungry. Imagine that this is where his decisions got him. That he's actually yearning and starving for pig slop. And it even says there, but no one gave him anything. He couldn't even have that. Friends, turning away from God always leaves us in a pigsty. Ask this question of yourself: what have you squandered that the Lord has given you? In what situation has your sin left you in? I don't mean merely what's the sum of your choices, but what's the result of a diminishing of God himself? Friends, our sin isn't only in breaking God's rules, it's breaking God's heart. The climax of looking at this younger son is in what the son thinks and feels next, his idea of what it means to be a son. Do you notice his "I'm sorry" speech that he practices to himself? The author puts this in quotes. Of all the things the son did and said so far in his squandering, the author has not quoted one thing the son has said. Now, Jesus decides to quote the son. This gives us a window into the son's heart. This is what we're meant to see as readers of this. Notice verses 19, 20, and 21. This is the son's idea of sonship. Starting in verse 18. I will rise and go to my father, and I will say to him. He's saying this to himself, right? This is his inner dialogue. Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Again, he says that to himself. On the way home, Jesus repeats it. Again, for the readers, we've already read this, but it's coming up again, which means it's important. You see the same phrase, he's now saying it to his dad. He says it again. Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. What's his idea of sonship? Do you see it? I've lost my sonship because I've sinned my way out of it. Do you see that? I've sinned, therefore I'm not worthy to be a son, so treat me as a servant. I've sinned my way from son to servant. That's the son's idea of sonship. Notice verse 22, how the Father responds. The Father gives him and the Father gives us the truth, the correction, the clarity about sonship. Because honestly, this younger son is now confused as to what a son is. Here's how the Father gives us the glorious truth about sonship. Verse 22, but the Father said, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. What's the Father saying about sonship? He's saying it's not what you do that makes you a son. It's who you are. The son thought, I've disobeyed my way out of the family. And the Father reminds him, that's not how sonship works. My son is my biological son here this morning. can anything he do make that biology not true? Is action, does it qualify or disqualify my fatherhood over him? No. See, the son thinks he can disobey his way out of the family. And the father says, being a son is not about what you do, it's about who you are. You're a son. No amount of sin can disqualify sonship. You notice the son doesn't even finish his speech. Why? Because the father interrupts him with joy, interrupts him with generosity, interrupts him with forgiveness. The father is unconcerned about this view that the son has about disqualifying himself. The father is unconcerned with that. Why? Because he's a dad. And friend, here's the glorious truth for you. You can't sin your way out of the family. Because sonship is not about what you do, it's about who you are. Notice another son. Number two, our point number two this morning is the religious older son. Let me read for you how the story continues. Verse 25 to 32. Now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him. But he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you. I have never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has devoured your property with prostitutes and killed the fattened calf, you killed the fattened calf for him? And he said to him, son, you are always with me. All that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. Friend, would you notice the numerous ways Jesus portrays this son now? This older brother, this older son? Notice as Jesus tells the story, verse 25, where the brother is. Do you see it? Out in the field. See, he's the good son. He's a hard worker. He's probably been doing double the labor since younger brother took off. He's been picking up the slack as property has been squandered. He's pitching in to help the father maybe reclaim what was lost or make more profit. Verse 25 as well, you see he drew near. When he heard there was a party, he heard the music bumping, he was asked about what's going on. Verse 27, look what happens next. He's told from one of the servants, your younger brother has returned, and your dad slaughtered the fattened calf, hired a DJ, catered a banquet, right? This is a large party here. And the brother is told this. Do you see the older brother's reaction to this news? Look at verse 28. But he was angry and refused to go in, though his father came out and entreated him, encouraged him, admonished, invited him to come in. The brother here is refusing to participate. Notice the first 3 verses we read at the very beginning, because here's what Jesus is doing. He's matching these brothers onto the very listeners of the story in front of him, the audience that prompted this story to be told. Notice the connections. Jesus is in verse 1 and 2. Do you remember this? This is why Jesus told the story here. Jesus is receiving sinners and eating with them. There's a banquet. Jesus is receiving sinners to his presence, and he's feasting with them. And the Pharisees draw near. Do you see that? And they're grumbling about the feast. So Jesus tells a story about the same thing. Tells a story about feasting with a sinner while there's a grumbler outside. Do you notice that? So Jesus tells this story prompted by the Pharisees, the religious older men grumbling about the party Jesus has with sinners. Meaning, if this is what's happening with the older brother in the story, if we get the older brother, if we get what's going on with this son, we get the whole parable. This older brother at the end is why Jesus told the story. These grumbling Pharisees are the target audience for this parable. The point of the parable is understanding the older brother. Notice the older brother's attitude on display for us. The attitude he has toward his father in verse 29 and 30. If you'd see this with me. He said to his father, see the first word he says? Look. Already off to a bad start, right? If you start a conversation with your dad saying, look, there's already disrespect from the very beginning. Do you see that? Notice what else he says. I served you. I never disobeyed. I never got a goat to celebrate with my friends. You see what it's about? It's all about himself. And here's the thing. It's all about his obedience. Do you see that? I've never disobeyed. I've always served you. And here's the stunning thing about the parable. The father's response to this son corrects his misunderstanding of sonship. He needs to hear the same thing his younger brother heard. Do you see it? Here's what he says. Both sons have a misunderstanding of sonship. This older brother thinks he can obey his way into the family, while the younger son thought he could sin his way out of the family. This son thinks he can obey his way in. This son also needs to hear, it's not about what you do that makes you a son, it's who you are. While for the rebellious son, no amount of disobedience could disqualify him. But for the religious son, he needs to hear that no amount of obedience qualifies him as a son. Do you see this? Being a son is not about what you do, good or bad. Disobedience doesn't kick you out of the family. Friend, obedience doesn't bring you into the family. The Father doesn't discard you because you've sinned, and he doesn't accept you if you obey. Why? Because you're a son. You're a daughter through Christ. You don't lose his love if you sin. You don't earn his love as you obey. Both sons have the same misunderstanding of sonship. Furthermore, would you notice the accusations here the older brother has against his father? Notice just the scathing accusations. It doesn't give us a picture of what this brother's hands are doing, but there's probably a pointer finger pointing right at the father, accusing him. Do you see it? You never gave me a goat to celebrate. This son of, what does he say? This son of yours, not my brother. Dad, this is your son. Do you see that? And you killed a fattened calf. Do you see the accusation? One of the evidences here this son is trying to make that he deserves a party is that he's never disobeyed. That's probably unlikely. But let's say, for the sake of his argument, that up until now he's never disobeyed. What's the father want from him at this moment? Go in and celebrate with your brother. See what he's doing? Refusing. There's a party your father wants you to attend and you won't. Do you guys see that the first son had to flee into a distant land, a far country, to put distance between himself and his dad? Do you notice this son? He's in the same field, but he couldn't be further from his father. Both sons have distance from their dad. The one son in rebellion, and this son in an attitude of entitlement and pride, thinking he's earned his father's love. Both sons, and here's the thing, both sons are lost from their dad. Both sons are against the father. Do you see that? The one son took off, and the other son took offense. Both sons are lost from their dad, misunderstanding sonship. This son is as against his father as the first one, although one son returns. And this son, the story ends, he's still against the father. Who's really the lost son of the story? Friend, where are you? Which misunderstanding of sonship do you tend toward if left to your own thinking? Do you look through the list of things done wrong, the ways you failed, the ways you again fell into sin, temptation, and bad attitude, and think, I'm not worthy to be a son? You need to hear, friend, the words of this Father that says, it's not what you do that makes you a son, it's who you are. Or are you the other one that looks at that and is angry because you've never disobeyed? You've served the Lord for so many years. You're out in the field. You have a shovel in your hand. Your hands are dirty with hard labor for the Lord. And when hardship comes or grace appears for someone else who hasn't worked as hard as you also misunderstand sonship, thinking, haven't I obeyed my way into favor? Haven't I earned God's love for me? Friend, you need to hear, it's not what you do that makes you a son or daughter of the King. It's who you are. Finally, this morning, let's look at our third character here, the Father. Let's linger on the details here Jesus provides for us. He's not just a generous dad in a random story. This is supposed to echo the ministry of Jesus, as he's the one telling the story about what's going on in the moment, right? And Jesus' ministry, as John says throughout that gospel, it echoes the heart of the Father. If you know Jesus, you know the Father. If you know this Father in this story, you know Jesus, and therefore you know the Heavenly Father. It's the character of God on display. Look here at the Father's actions spelled out for us. Verse 20. Bring your eyes to that verse if you would. While the son was still a long way off, there in the middle of verse 20, do you see it? While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. He saw his son far away. That just doesn't happen by accident. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail the text doesn't provide just to paint you a picture of what this could have been. This is how I see it in my mind. His son's been gone for a while. It's been weeks, it's maybe been months. Who knows, maybe it was even a longer time, but I get the idea. The father walks downstairs, another morning, starting a new day, down a few stairs, gets to a landing, looks out his window at the horizon, there's the road his son took. He remembers his son walking away from him down that road. He looks out, he can see it for a distance, hoping today might be the day his son comes home. No one's there, and so he continues down the steps, works on his property, manages all that he has. And every morning it's the same thing. Lingers there at the window, looking down that road. No one's there. Next day comes again and again. He's finally almost ready to turn, as he always does, and look away from the window, but there's a figure on the horizon this time. I wonder if he could tell far away that that's his son. I was running late to my son's soccer game about a year ago or more, and I pull up to the I park, and there's parents and soccer players, and it's right, the whole complex of fields, so there's games everywhere, right? Hundreds of people either watching or playing soccer. And I glanced for a while, but and these fields are all far away from me. I don't know which way to go, right? If I'm going to be on time for this game, I need to find the field. It didn't take me long to find the field. Do you know why? I could tell my son's walk. Parents, you know what I mean? And a bunch of kids that all have the same jerseys on, you can tell which one's yours. Why? You can tell their walk, right? That's him. And I think looking down the road, this father on the horizon saw a figure walking. It's him. I can see his walk, right? And so it says next, the father saw him, and when he saw him, guess what he felt? You see there in verse 20, he felt compassion. Isn't this so different than how you and I are tempted to respond when someone has sinned against us grievously? This son tanked his father's finances. And more than that, just the relational offense of wishing him dead and taking off. And when the father saw him, compassion is what he felt. Not bitterness, not anger. And so what does he do in verse 20? Out of feeling compassion when he sees him, he runs. Do you guys see that? He ran up to him. And in the ancient world, this is very undignified for an older man to do. Older men did not run. Maybe it's still true. I don't know. Sons in the room, ask, when was the last time you saw your dad run? Right? My kids are not allowed to ask that. I have not run in years, right? And more so, it was even probably difficult because for some reason they wore a dress back then, right? So imagine this older man hiking up so that his clothing doesn't get in the way of his legs running. So undignified for a man, especially of his status, to start running. This just didn't happen. And when he got to his son, notice what it says. He embraced him and kissed him. He doesn't scold him, doesn't punish him. The law in that land in that day provided the ability, this father could have even beaten and killed his son for what he had done. The law would have let him do that. Instead, there's an embracing and a kissing. Notice the father's attitude. Verse 24. This son of mine, he says, was lost and is found. He was, you see it there, he was dead and now is alive. This is amazing. The son that wished you dead, you're just now happy he's alive. This is incredible. Notice the elaborate love he pours out for his son right away. He calls all of his servants to start up and to get ready and prepare for and provide a humongous banquet and party. This is incredible. The son has already been so expensive for the father. He has already cost the father so much, and the father's ready to give just pour out more. He's going to pour out an expensive party for the son that took half his money. Notice verse 22. What does he say? Put on the best robe. Who do you think in the house has the best robe? The father. Whose robe is going to go on this son who took everything? The father's robe. At the father's own expense, he covers the offense. He says this, put a ring on his finger. This son was probably gone long enough. He was legally considered dead. The ring on the finger symbolizes the son is reinstated again. Reinstated as a son. Reinstated as an heir to the family. You're fully back. He says to the servants, put shoes on his feet. Guess what? Servants back then didn't wear shoes. So he says to the very servants that are supposed to go get the shoes, those servants are barefoot. But he sees his son over here as barefoot. That's inappropriate. Servants wear shoes. What's he saying about his son? Not a servant. Sons wear shoes. I will not see my son as a servant, as my son wished to be seen. I will see him as a son. And then he says, kill the fattened calf. It's going to be a bloody scene. It's going to be costly to receive this sinful son back. But friends, the father is so willing. I want to end by looking to Jesus, because guess what? There's a third son in the passage. Do you see it? There's a third son. Do you notice it? It's the son telling the story. Do you see him? He's not a religious son. He's not a rebellious son. He's the Son of God. Jesus has never been against his Father. He's always been desirous of relationship with the Father. And I would be doing you a disservice this morning if I didn't point the details of this parable to the very person and work of Jesus for us. Jesus isn't unrighteous. Jesus doesn't have a self-righteousness. Jesus has a real righteousness, and he gives it out generously. But Jesus does not give out his righteousness to the insistent, nor the deserving, because there are none. Jesus gives out his righteousness to those who know that they need it. Jesus was always desirous of relationship with his Father. But now, the Son of God is no longer in heaven with his Father, but he's on earth. See, Jesus took a journey into a far country, but not one of rebellion. Jesus took a journey into a far country because he was on a mission to find and save dead, lost sinners. 8 chapters later from this one, in the book of Luke, he writes that Jesus goes to a cross. And just like the Father ran to the Son, very undignified, friend, so the Son of God runs to you via the cross, so undignified, as Jesus hung there with no clothes to cover his shame, hung there tortured and put among other criminals, mocked with a crown of thorns on his head. God couldn't be more undignified in his journey to you. And like the fattened calf was killed for them to celebrate, friend, Jesus was slaughtered like an animal, killed, so that you could celebrate and enjoy intimacy with God your Father. It was a costly, bloody scene, friend, for you to be reinstated as a son. Shoes on your feet, ring on a finger, if you put faith in Christ. Our reconciliation back to God, it was bloody, costly, yet just like the robe, it truly clothed us with someone else's clothes, someone else's righteousness, someone else's status, just gifts it to you through faith. Friend, you can't sin your way out of it. You can't obey your way into it. It's the coming to the Father, needy, desperate, and sorry, and the Father just welcomes you back at his own cost. The ending of the story, it is a cliffhanger. If you were to somehow put this into a film, right? What's the scene the story ends with? The story ends with this scene. The Father's at the doorway, the party's behind them, people celebrating, enjoying the Son that's returning. The Son is partying with the Father. The Son is glad he's back. He's no longer lost. Why? Because he's with his dad. Who's the lost son at the end of the story? It's this brother who's not in the party, a brother who's against his dad, and a brother who's still in the field, shovel in hand. He's a son. He's not a servant, but he's living like a servant. Hands are dirty with labor, a tool of work in his hand. Why can't he put down the shovel and walk in the party? Why can't he? Because his idea of sonship is, I have to work my way in. The story ends with a cliffhanger, not of the father and the younger brother. They're doing fine. The story ends with a cliffhanger of who the real target audience of this story is. It's not rebellious sinners who think they can't find forgiveness. That's true, and if that's you this morning, be encouraged by the gospel. But the cliffhanger at the end of the story is meant for the real trouble. It's not as hard to repent of our badness. It's hard to repent of the idea of our goodness. Thinking, for you and I, that it's actually our obedience as to why the Father loves us. And when we can discard that through the freedom of the gospel, we can drop the shovel, thinking we need to work into our love for God, and we can actually walk into the party and actually just enjoy God. Friend, I invite you to do that. If you need to be encouraged, thinking you've sinned your way out, you're a son. The Father lavishly forgives you and welcomes you. But for you that you think you've served God all these years, you've never disobeyed, and your idea of sonship is that your obedience qualifies you, I invite you to a better freedom. Drop the shovel, come out of the field, and come to a God that enjoys you as a son and a daughter, not as a servant. And you can walk into this celebration, walk into this feast to enjoy the actual relationship with your Father, because Jesus is dying to have you, literally. Friend, I invite you to go home and just meditate more on this parable if you have time today. Would you close in prayer with me?